The nationalization of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and AIG and the collapse of Lehman Brothers has literally sent shockwaves through the $62 trillion credit default swap market. What we saw happen with the whole mortgage mess is now spilling over into the CDS market. Now, I don't believe that we are in this mess because of just deregulation alone. The U.S. government with their socialistic bailouts, and the Federal Reserve with their the housing bubble they created, are to blame for this. However, the entire U.S. mortgage market still got out of hand, therefore it exacerbated things. Now, it is the unregulated CDS market that poses a much greater threat. For example, hedge funds were able to buy insurance, a credit default swap, for a bond it didn't necessarily own. Kind of like owning fire insurance on a home that isn't yours. Well, you may ask that in the past, if credit default swaps were triggered by a default, a hedge fund would just write more swaps to cover it. So what's the problem? Well, right now, the credit default swap market is largely frozen following the collapse of Lehman Brothers Holdings, which was actually one of the top 10 players in the CDS market, and other Wall Street financial institutions like AIG. Furthermore, the hedge funds that wrote these swaps never really put aside any capital to cover them. A lot of the banks that bought the swaps from the hedge funds have quietly eaten the loss because the banks and others in the markets don't want to arouse any attention because the regulators in the bankruptcy court. A lot of the times dealers come in to clean things up, but not this time. This time it's all coming out in the open because of the mounting defaults, and these banks they just can't stomach the losses, which in return leads to more bankruptcies. There were just way too many credit default swaps, and people thought they were going to continue to make money until the whole banking crisis began. The banks started taking billions of dollars in losses because of the mortgage mess, and it ended up affecting the overall CDS market. And that is why we saw a domino effect where all of these institutions were and still are knocking each other down like domino blocks because they're all interconnected in the CDS market, insuring each other's debt. Just look at the large quantities of credit default swaps that AIG sold to practically every major financial institution. The collapse of AIG is what caused a global run on the banks. AIG didn't have to put up any capital as collateral on its swaps as long as it maintained a AAA credit rating. There really wasn't any limit to how many swaps were sold, and there really wasn't any capital cost to selling them either. And because of the expected default rate, AIG was able to book a profit from a 5-year CDS as soon as the contract was sold. The entire CDS market was just an unregulated mess. AIG was able to sell credit default swaps without bothering to collateralize the risk, so that is what really made things worse in the whole CDS market. And guess who AIG's largest trading partner was? Goldman Sachs. Goldman hedged its exposure through credit default swaps with AIG. And of course, the moment AIG went bankrupt, Goldman lost $20 billion, and they had to raise billions more. These investment banks have become completely reliant on the Federal Reserve, which has allowed them to become commercial banks to fund their daily operations. I mean, things are so bad right now at the investment banks, the Fed had to change the rules to allow Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs the ability to use equities as collateral for these loans. So we can clearly see that things have gotten much worse, and had the government not bailed out AIG, they could have caused every major bank in the country or even the world to fail. Even the European Bank was able to assure its regulators it was holding only AAA credits instead of a bunch of subprime toxic junk. The bank could leverage itself to the full extent that was allowable under the global banking regulations. But because of the magnitude of this crisis, there are so many different scenarios that could play out right now as far as the CDS market goes. And it's not just in the financials; it's spreading to other parts of the economy, which I'll get into. On Saturday, I believe there was an auction of about $400 billion in credit default swaps for Lehman that was held. The auction determined that the bank's borrowings were worth only a little over 8 cents on the dollar, which means the insurers of the debt have to pay about $365 billion. Now, according to Financial Times, the big bank insurers to Lehman Brothers swaps have been hoarding a lot of cash, probably around $400 billion. So they probably will be able to pay. However, that isn't the real problem here. The real problem is whether the hedge funds will be able to pay or not, which we will probably see in a couple of weeks. So once again, the crisis is nowhere near over. According to New York Times, there are $45 trillion in credit default swaps protecting loans totaling about $15.7 trillion. If these loans started collapsing, the underwriters of credit default swaps would be they'd be knocked down like domino blocks, which will threaten the whole derivatives market again. So I mean, if you really think about it, it's just a domino effect threatening the whole markets. I mean, they're all getting knocked down. They're knocking each other down like flies. It's crazy. It really is. The Bank of International Settlements, which I believe is the only institution that tracks the derivatives market, actually reported in July of 2008 that global outstanding derivatives have reached 1.4 trillion, or I'm sorry, quadrillion dollars. 548 trillion in listed credit derivatives plus 596 trillion in notional OTC derivatives. That's right, $540 trillion in listed credit derivatives. Now, because of the crisis in the CDS market, it could still affect the credit derivatives market. Many investors think of derivatives as time bombs ready to go off, which makes sense. In fact, they almost went off earlier this year with the Bear Stearns debacle. Bear Stearns held about $13.4 trillion in derivatives. And the whole facade could have imploded if JP Morgan didn't step in and add Bear Stearns derivatives to its own $77 trillion portfolio, giving them a grand total of $90 trillion in these derivatives. So we could have seen the entire U.S. economy collapse because of the Bear Stearns crisis, setting off a chain reaction in the credit derivatives market. And it wasn't just the U.S. that was involved in the CDS market either. Pretty much every major foreign government was. So this is truly a global financial crisis. And now, and the CDS crisis isn't just, like I said, affecting one part of the economy. It's affecting the auto industry, which I will get into next.